Hello, I'm Mr. McNeil, and this is Vocabulary Breakdown, Kinematics, Part 3. So when it comes to describing motion, we've talked about velocity and speed, which are basically the terms for motion. But what happens if an object is changing its motion? Well, that comes to this vocabulary word, and that is acceleration. And most of us think we understand what acceleration is, but most of us don't necessarily apply it properly. Now, the definition of acceleration is how much an object's velocity is changing in a given amount of time. Like velocity, like speed, it's a rate. But interestingly enough, when we talk about acceleration, it's the rate of change of a rate. So velocity is how far it's traveling in a given amount of time, and acceleration is how much that velocity is changing in a given amount of time. So as an example, if an object had an acceleration of, let's say, 2 meters per second, that means I would know that its velocity would increase by 2 meters per second every second. So it may be going at 20 meters per second at 1 second, and then 22 meters per second the next second. It's a little bit harder to get your head around, and that's okay. Acceleration, like I said, is something we think we know, but we don't quite know it scientifically. It's a very difficult word to kind of get our head around. Cool? And so the next thing I wanted to talk about is when we talk about motion, one of the things that we experience when we're in motion is braking. So if I am moving along at a speed and I am applying the brakes, I should correct myself. If I am moving along with a velocity and I apply my brakes, I'm expecting my car to slow down or my object to slow down. So braking is in fact acceleration because it is changing the velocity of that object. Now, it's a little more complicated when we deal with the mathematics of braking and acceleration and velocity. So I'm going to pick a really simple situation. And remember, velocity has a direction. So let's say that we have an object that's traveling at 20 meters per second, and it's heading east. It applies the brakes, and the brakes are going to slow that velocity down by 2 meters per second every second. So the car is moving at 20 meters per second, and it's experiencing a braking of 2 meters per second. Braking is creating what's known as a negative acceleration in this case. Not in all cases, but in this simple case, that 2 meters per second is a negative. So it would be traveling at 20 and then be reduced down to 18 in 1 second, 16 in another second, 14 in another second, and on and on and on. Okay? So braking is the act of reducing my speed. Okay? And as it's reducing my speed, it's also affecting my velocity. The mathematical tricky part is, what if my car was traveling 20 meters per second to the west? Now, the west is in the opposite direction of that first example of 20 meters per second in the east. That means in that case, the velocity would actually be negative 20 meters per second. And if I were to apply braking, which is reducing my speed, it's actually going in the opposite direction of that velocity. So in this case, my acceleration is 2 meters per second. So that negative 20 would reduce down to negative 18 in 1 second, negative 16 the next second, negative 14 the second after that, negative 12 the second after that. So braking is actually a discussion about reducing speed, but we can apply it to our concepts of acceleration and velocity. We just have to be very careful about direction, which is often expressed as negatives and positives. Cool? It's a complicated idea and it needs to be explored more, but right now I'm just trying to get you to think about it. Now the next one is turning. So if I were to drive a car and I was to turn my wheel so that I was traveling east at 20 meters per second at 1 second, and then all of a sudden traveling at 20 meters per second to the south or to the north, am I accelerating? Well, it's a tough question. So the general definition of acceleration is a change in velocity. Did my velocity change? Now, my gut reaction is to look at that and go, no, I'm going at 20 meters per second. But remember, speed is 20 meters per second. The velocity, at least the initial case, was 20 meters per second to the east, and then the final case was 20 meters per second to the south. So the direction in which the object is traveling is changing. So because velocity is both defined by magnitude, how fast, and direction, east, west, north, south, that means that if my direction changes, then my velocity changes, and therefore I'm accelerating. Now, this acceleration has a very specific name. It's called centripetal acceleration, and it will be covered in a different topic entirely. But just understand that because the direction changed, so did the velocity. Okay? So if you like anything, if you have any questions about the concept of acceleration, please let me know. I'd be happy to talk about it more.